Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back in an episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you how to paint Beastmen Brayherd Bestigor both quickly and more importantly cheaply for your games of Warhammer the Old World. By following the tips, techniques, and materials C suggests, we can paint your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $29. And when compared for materials that you need to purchase from Army Painter and Citadel, we will help you save over $182 at the same time. So as you can see, this is exactly what your Bestigor will look like. We have a beautiful tabletop standard. We're going to show you guys how to paint these guys up both quickly and cheaply. So once you assemble your miniatures, the next thing you need to do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. In this case, I decided to use Rust-Oleum Flat Red Primer. And the reason why I decided to use this flat red primer is because it's kind of like a brownish reddish color, which is actually quite nice to work off of. It's not as bright as white, for example, but at the same time, though, if I do miss a spot or two of my painting, it's not that bad because it actually looks like it's part of the flesh or the shadows of the recesses. So this is a good color to use as a base to work on my Beastmen. That way I could just do a couple of dry brushing and some base coating really quickly, and then I could just move on from the fur and the flesh and work on the other colored elements on the miniature. So once you basically spray this down, it costs you $3.99 to local Walmart. Next we gotta do, of course, is a dry brush. So we're going to dry brush pretty much the entirety of the miniature with Territorial Beige. You can get this color at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. It's made by Apple Barrel Paint. I'm just going to do a quick dry brush all over the miniatures so that way I can catch up on the raised surfaces. Now dry brushing does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, it creates the illusion of depth in your miniatures by leaving that darker color in the recesses while the pigments actually adhere to the raised surfaces of your miniatures. Now you'll notice there is a bit of a chalky kind of pastel texture with these miniatures because of the dry brushing, but don't stress out. The reason why is because when we get to the oil wash stage, that's going to smooth out the transitions that we're seeing between our base coats and our dry brushes. And as you can see, by doing this, a lot of the fur, like around the faces, the arms, and the legs and such, are pretty much done because of that. So you could, of course, change those colors if you want to, which I'm going to do in this video to show you guys some color varieties that can be created with your Bestigor, but you could actually just move on to the metallics as well as other details if you really wanted to. Now for me, because I like to do things the difficult way and to add a lot of color variety to my miniatures, I'm actually going to paint the flesh of these miniatures really quickly in 3 different shades. I'm going to use Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint for about 2 of these guys. For 3 of these guys, I'm going to use Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint, and for the other 3, I'm going to use Taupe Gray by Anita's Acrylic. Now the Apple Barrel Paints will cost you 50 cents at your local Walmart, while Anita's Acrylic costs 65 cents. I'm going to put 2 thin layers on all the exposed flesh on the upper torso, so that way we have some color variation in these fighters. And now that we have the base coats down, we're going to use Delta Cerakote Peaches and Cream for the flesh-colored Bestigor that we did earlier. We're going to use Pale Gray by Folk Art for the Bestigor we did in Pavement. And for the Bestigor that we did in Taupe Gray, we're going to use Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint in order to dry brush that. Now the Delta Cerakote is going to cost you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, while the Folk Art costs 75 cents at Walmart. And of course the Apple Barrel Paint costs 50 cents at Walmart as well. Just do a quick dry brushing on all the exposed flesh on these characters to bring out a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. And then we can move on to the next detail. And because I'm also a glutton for punishment, I decided to work on the hindquarters for 3 of these guys, just to add a little bit of color variety amongst the rest of the squad, so that way some of them have brown fur, but we also have some other color varieties too. For 2 of these fighters, I painted their hindquarters using Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint, and for another one, I used Pewter Gray, which costs 50 cents at your local Walmart, for another one, just to add some color variation within the squad. And we're going to dry brush the hindquarters. For the fighters that I did in Pavement earlier, I'm going to use Pewter Gray to dry brush their hindquarters, and for the one that we did in Pewter Gray before, we're going to use Pale Gray by Folk Art for that guy. Just add a little bit more color variation between the squad. We're also going to divide the squad between 2 different groups as well. We're going to paint the hooves of their hindquarters. We're going to paint half the squad in Pavement paint, and the other half we're going to do Territorial Beige, just so that we have some color contrast between their hindquarters as well as for their for their hooves as well, to add a little bit of color variation for these miniatures. So with the flesh and the fur fully completed, the next we're going to work on now are all the wooden elements these guys have. These guys are carrying huge double-handed axes, as well as a standard bearer, as well as a mace. So for the shafts of those weapons, as well as the standard bearer, we're going to pick that out 2 thin layers of Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a beautiful dark brown color that you can get at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. We're going to put 2 coats of paint on those shafts of the weapons and equipment, and then ready to move on to the horns. So the next one we're going to work on are all the bone elements around these miniatures, primarily the horns on their heads as well as the skulls are hanging from the belts as well as from the standard bearer above. So because we're going to use light mocha by Apple Barrel Paint in order to do this, we're going to put two thin coats down on all the horns, the bone elements of these miniatures to create a nice contrast to all the earth tones we're seeing for this army so far. The next step we're going to work on, of course, is to dry brush all the bone elements that we did earlier in light mocha with Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint. We're going to do this for all the skulls, the bones, as well as the horns these characters have. As you can see, there's quite a bit of them, from the horn that's being played by the musician to the skulls that are mounted on their belts and along their waistcoats, as well as the horns they have on the top of their head. And once we have that detail done, the next thing we're going to work on are their clothing. So now we're going to work on the clothing of the Bestigors, primarily the smocks that they're wearing as well as the standard bearer that's being carried by the leader. We're going to pick out two of these guys in two thin layers of Apple Barrel's green turquoise. It's a nice vibrant green turquoise color that contrasts very nicely with all the earth tones in this gang. We're also going to paint up the tunics for these guys in Holly Branch for Apple Barrel Paint, also costs 50 cents. It's a beautiful vibrant green color that contrasts nicely with all the browns in this unit. And then last, we're going to use Tuscan Teal by Apple Barrel Paint as well, which also costs 50 cents for two of these fighters, just so that we have a nice color variety in this squad and make it look a little bit different. Like I said before, I really wanted to do was a create like this earth tone color, and these greens and teals actually do a really good job of contrasting, I guess, the earth tones that is primarily banking this army, which adds a lot of visual interest to the army as a whole. So the next detail we're going to work on now is to dry brush all the fabric that we just painted early. Regardless of what color that we used earlier, we're going to use exactly the same color to dry brush them all, which is Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And the reason why we do this is so that way it all kind of blends together with the different colors, so that way these guys are kind of cohesive. As you can see, it creates that three-dimensional look by using that darker color in the recesses, while also at the same time capturing things like the texture as well as the folds of the fabric using that dry brushing technique. The next element we're going to work on next is the cording along the grips of the weapons as well as the instruments that these characters are creating. And for that color, we're using Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. It's a beautiful rich blue color that you can get your local Walmart for about local Hobby Lobby, for about 65 cents. And the reason why I like to use this color is because it's a nice stark contrast to all the browns that we have in this army as well. It's an eye-catching color. It's a very nice visual detail that also kind of goes nicely with the greens, blues, and teals that we use for their clothing. And like I said before, it contrasts really well with the rest of the browns and earth tones that this army actually has. And one of the last few details we're going to work on before we move on and transition to the metallic colors are the leather goods that these characters have. So a lot of these guys have belts around their bodies to secure the armor to their bodies. As you can see, this shows up on the back of the characters. So for that, I picked out two thin layers of pigment paint, just because it's a nice dark color that contrasts nicely with the bright colors that we used for their tunics. And once that detail is done, we can move on to the metallic elements. So the first metallic element we're going to work on is the chainmail these characters are wearing. Now we could use just normal standard steel color to do that, but unfortunately it's a little boring. So to make these guys a little bit more visually appealing and to make it look more interesting, I decided to use Anita's Acrylic Aged Copper to create the chainmail that these guys are wearing. To make it look like the chainmail is kind of weathered and kind of worn, and maybe a little bit of rusted has gotten to the actual individual links of chain. And the reason why I decided to go with that color is because, oddly enough, I was actually inspired by the Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers. In the climatic fight scene in that movie, the character Aragorn, played by Viggo Mortensen, puts on a chainmail coat over his clothing to act as armor, and it's got this beautiful kind of copperish color that he uses in that chainmail. I thought that was really eye-catching. I thought that was a really cool looking detail from that film, so I decided to use that exact same thing on the chainmail from a Bestigor to make it look like it kind of blends in with the overall earth tone nature of the army's color scheme. The next color we're going to work on is Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. We're going to use this for most of the metallic elements on these miniatures. So these guys have huge pauldrons on their shoulders, as well as, I'm not sure what you would call the technical term, but they have like metal plates protecting their thighs that they're wearing. I guess you would call it like I guess a skirt, I guess you would call it. I'm not sure really call it. I'm not an armorer. But anyways, so they have armor panels protecting their upper thighs as well. We're also using for the blades of the huge axes these guys are carrying, as well as the mace, the ball head of the mace as well. So any metallic elements that we have to be bright silver, we just paint that on two thin layers of gunmetal gray. You get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. We did things like the spikes on the standard bearer, for example, the axe blade of the standard bearer as well, and same thing with all the bladed weapons these characters are carrying. The next one we're going to pick out as well are the arm greaves as well as the lave greaves that these characters are carrying. I wanted to create that look like that their armor is kind of like piecemeal together from different types of different armors from different factions or different armies or from different time periods that the Beastmen have been around and they kind of looted from. So I want to create this kind of hodgepodge piecemeal look when it comes to their armor. So for those colors, for the arm greaves and the leg greaves, we're using Copper by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. You just put two thin layers of this stuff on all the leg greaves as well as the arm greaves that these characters are wearing. It contrasts nicely against the gunmetal gray for their shoulder armor, as well as for the armor that protects their thighs. At the same time, it's also very complementary to the aged copper that we use for the chainmail of their cloaks. And the last one we're going to use, of course, is, I would guess you would call them face guards, I guess what you would call them. They're not exactly helmets because they don't really encircle the entire head, but they have like these weird kind of plates of metal that protects the forehead as well as the top of their head. I guess we'd call it a faceplate, I guess what you would actually call it. So for that detail, we're going to pick that on 2 thin layers of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. It's a rich golden color that contrasts nicely against the silver as well as the copper elements of these guys' armor. Like I said, I want to create this kind of piecemeal look that these guys are wearing, and it actually does a really good job of bringing that out. And then of course, when you combine that with the gunmetal gray that we use for the blades on the top of their face plates, it looks absolutely fantastic, and it's also very eye-catching as well. And once we get done with that little final detail of that, as well as some of the weapon iconography on the blades of their weapons, we're ready to move on to the last few final details before we start working on the bases. So the last few fine detail pieces that we're working on are the cording, but this time we're talking about the cording of their faceplates. If you look at closely at the miniatures, their faceplates are actually strapped down on top of their heads. So we picked out those straps that crisscross their faces with 2 thin coats of pavement paint by Apple Barrel Paint. It contrasts nicely against their skin tone. At the same time, it also contrasts nicely with the gold that we use for their faceplates. And the last thing we did, of course, is the cording of the individual knots and ropes that hold the skulls to their body for like their loot and stuff, so along their waist as well as along the loincloths. And then that pretty much makes the very final details before we work on the bases. Now, as for the base work on these ones, these miniatures specifically I bought secondhand, and these guys were actually mounted on Age of Sigmar textured bases. I guess Age of Sigmar had like this limited run of bases that had like a lot of cracks and ruins and masonry and that kind of stuff. The guy I bought these from decided to mount most of his miniatures on those types of bases. So because I painted the entire surface of those bases with Tuscan teal, it's a beautiful dark turquoise color, and the reason why I did that is for 2 reasons. One, it contrasts nicely with all the earth tones that this army actually has inside of it for Beastmen, and the second reason why is because it's exactly the same kind of color scheme I use for a lot of the ruins that I use for Warcry as well as for Mordheim as well. And plus, like I said before, it contrasts nicely with all the browns. We just put 2 thin layers all over the bases and we're ready to do a dry brush. So once again, we just do a quick dry brush with Dutch Aqua to bring out a lot of the texturing that we see on the bases that these guys have. So we have bas relief type of sculptures carved directly into the bases as well. It also brings out a lot of the texturing we couldn't see before, like runic writing and things like skulls, for example. Now, unfortunately, I forgot to take a photo of the next step that I did, but actually when I saw those skulls kind of put inside the masonry, I decided to pick out those details because I thought it'd be kind of cool to have those skulls kind of pop up. I use light mocha and 2 thin coats of that to bring up those skulls. I do apologize for not showing this because I forgot to take a photo of it, but in the next photo you'll see those little details brought out. So now that we're done, we're going to do a quick oil wash all over the entirety of the miniatures. So like I said before, this is a quick paint method, and but usually when we do a quick paint, most people use oil washing as the final step of their painting process to wash the miniatures down. Now, oil washing does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures and brings a lot of the details we couldn't see before. Things like texturing on the bases, the folds of the fabric, the individual rivets of the armor that they're carrying, the texturing of their antlers and their fur, all kinds of wonderful details that weren't available before. The second thing that the oil washing also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushes and the base coats. As you can see, that pastel kind of chalky texture is now gone because those colors have been smoothed over together and kind of blended, so they look really bright. And the third thing that we also do too is that we mute down the vibrancy of the brightness of the colors that we use on these miniatures. The reason why we use such bright colors before is because that oil wash is going to darken down that value, and we wanted to create that look. Now, when it comes to the oil washing stage, a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone. It's a wonderful product that is exactly as advertised. The only problem though is it's quite expensive at $32.99 per can. What I like to use for my cheap alternative is Midwax Polyshade and Mission Oak. It does exactly the same thing, but only costs $6.99, and that's what I like to use for that product. Now, you will need to let for these miniatures to dry and cure for 24 hours, and the reason why is because there is polyurethane in that stain for both products, but in this case, especially so for the Midwax Polyshade. Usually I use this at the last step of my painting process, so that way I can return back to the next time I do painting. It'll be dried and hardened and fully cured by that point. Now that we're done with those miniatures, the next thing we do, of course, is to rim the bases, and for that I use 2 thin coats of Territorial Beige with Apple Barrel Paint, and the reason why I do that is so that way it contrasts nicely with the turquoise, the bases. Plus, I only have one other army in my studio's collection that does have Territorial Beige as the rim of a base, and that would be for my Wood Elf army that we have in our studio's collection. And since Beastmen and Wood Elves would make natural opponents because they both live in the forest, I thought we might as well give them the same kind of base to illustrate that fact. And then once we're done with that, the very last step is to do a matte varnish on the miniatures. Now that part, of course, is totally optional. The polyurethane does have a high gloss finish on your miniature, so if you do like that candy coated gloss finish, you can skip the matte varnish stage. However, I like a matte finish on my miniatures, so I buy a can of Krylon matte varnish spray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $5.99. I just spray them real quick with the matte varnish to mute down that sheen, and then our miniatures are fully completed. So as you can see, this is the end result of our miniatures with a beautiful tabletop standard, and we got these guys painted quickly and, more importantly, cheaply. So with that being said, let's talk about exactly what you'll need to purchase from Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to do exactly the same thing we did and achieve the exact same effects but using their products instead. Alright, so these are the materials you need to buy from Citadel as well as Army Painter to do exactly the same thing we did, but using their name brand paints. You'll need to buy a pot of Rackard Flesh, Ulthuan Gray, Thunderhawk Blue, Baneblade Brown, Longbeard Gray, Caliban Green, Cadian Flesh Tone, Baylor Brown, Slaanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, and Flaveone Flesh, and those cost $4.55 per pot. Now, the sad part about that, of course, is these are anywhere between 9 to 7 times more expensive than the cheap stuff we use for our craft paint to achieve exactly the same result. Whereas I get like 2 fluid ounces for mine, you get like a fraction of that with these Citadel paints instead. You also need to buy Pterodon Turquoise, Wildwood, Talisar Blue, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Aethermatic Blue, as well as Retributor Armor, and those pots cost $7.80, which is about 10 to 11 times more than what I'm paying for my cheap stuff. And then of course you need to buy a can of Army Painter Color Primer, which is called Fur Brown, which costs $17.99 to do the priming as well as the undercoating for a lot of your miniatures, as well as a can of Munitarian Varnish for $19.50 for that matte finish, and finally a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32. Now, assuming you're buying all those things for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $182.39 in order to paint up your Bestigor the same way we did, but using the name brand paints. Now, our cheapskate total is only $28.32, and when you compare the two, you're talking about a grand total savings of $154.04 being saved. So with that being said, as you can see, we got a beautiful tabletop finish for a fraction of the cost. So there you guys go. This is how you guys can quickly and, more importantly, cheaply paint up a squad of Bestigor and save a ton of money at exactly the same time. So if you're looking for a way to save money on your wargaming hobby, because miniatures are quite expensive, and you're looking for another way to save a lot of money, may I suggest using cheap craft paints from your local craft stores. This stuff costs anywhere between 11 to 10 times less than what Games Workshop as well as Army Painter would charge for similar products, and you get a just as good result as they would. Some would even argue it could be a better result, because you're saving money at the same time. You have a lot more volume of product as well. So as always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.